The web changes fast, and for the most part, HTML is changing right along with it. One of the most challenging aspects of web design is staying current with the languages and standards that you're going to be using. So I want to take a moment to talk about the current state of HTML. To do that, I find it's actually really helpful to take a brief look back at the history of HTML and how that's led to where we stand today. Because what's current at the time of me recording this isn't going to be current even, say, 3 months from now. So understanding how the language has developed is going to give you a better understanding of where it's headed. We can trace HTML's history all the way back to 1991, when Tim Berners-Lee published a document called HTML tags, which described a set of tags that could be used to mark up contents of online documents. Now, this eventually led to the publication of the first HTML specification, which was HTML 2.0, in 1995. HTML 3.2 followed in 1997, only to be replaced by HTML 4.0 later in the same year. So those early years saw a lot of specifications being developed in parallel to each other and released right around the same time. Now, the early days of HTML largely mirrored the internet itself, which means the specification matured alongside the web. Browser vendors would often ignore earlier specifications. They would propose their own tags or even implement them in different ways. So by the time HTML 4.0 was published, the web community had kind of banded together under a banner of web standards, and they began to push browser developers to support the specifications as they were written. And because of that, the HTML4 specification became the first one where support was nearly universal, and HTML 4.0 to this day remains the most stable specification of HTML. Now, around 2000, the W3C, which is the standards body that's responsible for publishing HTML, began the process of trying to move HTML towards XML by publishing the XHTML 1.0 specification. Their goal was to eventually have HTML follow the stricter rules of XML and have the language be more extensible. XHTML never really realized its vision of creating an extensible language. They had a lot of difficulties when they went to work on the XHTML 2.0 specification, and it just sort of stagnated. So in 2009, the W3C dropped the charter, and that essentially halted all work on moving HTML more towards XML. Now that leads us to where we currently are today with HTML5. While the W3C was busy focusing on XHTML, a group of organizations and individuals got together around 2004 to continue work on HTML. Their goal was to take the HTML 4.0 specification and just continue moving it forward. This group calls themselves the Web Hypertext Application Technology Working Group, which is also referred to as sort of the awkward WHAT working group. Their specification, which was entitled Web Applications 1.0, was actually eventually adopted by the W3C and renamed HTML5. So that leads us to the current state that we find ourselves in, which is we have two specifications of HTML being developed at the same time, one by the W3C and one by the WHAT working group. The two groups do cooperate with one another, but the specifications are considered independent of one another. The W3C is developing the HTML5 specification. Now, this has clear milestones, and once it reaches candidate recommendation, they'll move on to the HTML 5.1 specification. So this one's going to have a specific release date. The WHAT working group, on the other hand, is basically developing HTML as a living standard. So in that regard, they dropped the version number, although most people still refer to it as HTML5, and they're just constantly updating and revising it. Now, as you can imagine, these two specifications are beginning to diverge from each other in fairly significant ways. So one of your tasks as a web designer is going to be tracking both of these specifications and understanding how the different browser vendors are implementing both of these and which aspects of the specifications are making it into the browsers themselves. Now, that sounds daunting, and it does take a little bit of time. But to be honest, the HTML5 specification isn't that different from HTML 4.0. It does introduce a few new elements, and what it does more than anything else is it gives user agents clearer rules about HTML, how it should be parsed, how errors should be handled, things like that. Now, where the specification really diverges from 4.0 is its focus on building applications, things like drag and drop, location detection, support for drawing services like Canvas, things like that, make it really more of a platform for developing applications than a mere markup language. Now, for the most part, the W3C has split those application-focused areas into their own specifications. So a lot of what you hear referred to as HTML5 is actually a collection of individual specifications. What does that mean for you, or really anyone charged with authoring basic HTML? Well, for the moment, the bulk of sites online are either going to use HTML 4.0, XHTML 1.0, or the increasing number of HTML5 documents. And to be honest, there's really not a huge difference between pages that use any of those document types. For the most part, the biggest decision that you'll be faced with is which doc type to use, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later on. My advice is that if you're brand new to web design, start by learning the HTML5 syntax, focusing mainly on learning to write clean, well-structured HTML. And then you can gradually add the newer HTML5 features as you become more comfortable with it.